I felt an unexpected lightness in my heart as I prepared to leave the house, even if just for a while. My younger brother's wedding was coming up, and even though it was only going to be an overnight stay, I was busy packing. I had taken a few days off work to leave the house I shared with my in-laws, something I rarely did. As I was organizing my suitcase for the wedding, I heard my mother-in-law's voice behind me. With a contemptuous tone that I'd grown all too familiar with, she told me she hoped I would never come back, and suggested that I should just get divorced and leave. "Yes, I'll do exactly as you said," I responded calmly, meeting her sarcasm with a smile that masked years of endurance. I walked out with her scornful laughter echoing behind me. Before I got too far, I turned back to bid farewell to the house. "Thank you," I whispered softly. I hurried along, dragging a suitcase that was perhaps larger than necessary for a short trip. In my heart, I knew I wouldn't be returning to this house as a resident anymore. My husband, Todd, is the same age as me, and we have been married for over 31 years. Though ours was an arranged marriage through mutual acquaintances, we've shared similar values and managed to build a good life together. The only loneliness comes from his work as a merchant sailor. Working for a shipping company means he's often away from home, sometimes for more than a year at a time. Despite the distance, our relationship has remained strong, and we've been blessed with a son. We've lived with Todd's parents all these years. Until recently, I was the primary caregiver for Todd's grandmother. I used my salary to hire helpers during the day, but I was essentially her full-time caregiver otherwise. This continued until she passed away. When Todd said, "Linda, thank you for everything. Grandmother was happy, and I know she was always grateful to you," I couldn't hold back my tears. She was deeply loved and cherished by her children and great-grandchildren until the very end. In my younger years, when I was learning to manage a household, she taught me how to live properly. She was a kind and cheerful person, though she could be strict at times. Thanks to her support, I was able to continue working from a young age, even maintaining my part-time job during the caregiving period. While caregiving was undoubtedly challenging, I now look back on those days with fondness. I never imagined my environment would change so dramatically. Though Todd's frequent absences for his shipping work are difficult, I'm proud of his important role in American logistics. However, living with my in-laws has put me in an increasingly vulnerable position. From the moment his grandmother passed away, my mother-in-law's attitude changed dramatically. She had previously used sweet words to flatter me while pushing all caregiving responsibilities onto me, but as soon as that period ended, she began to ignore me completely. She would return from outings without bringing anything for me, and deliberately push past me when we crossed paths in the house. Her hostile attitude was shocking, and before I could even feel disgust, I was simply stunned by the transformation. In the midst of all this, my son Michael happened to visit and told me something troubling. He mentioned that his grandmother was saying cruel things about me again, which brought back painful memories. When Michael was 5 or 6 years old, there was a serious incident with my mother-in-law. She had planted baseless accusations in Michael's young mind, causing him such distress that he eventually told the whole family. She had told him that I would betray his father and leave someday, that I was worthless, that I didn't work, and that I was completely evil. She even claimed that his father didn't come home because he hated me. I was stunned to learn she had been feeding these lies to Michael while I was working every day and managing the household. Todd's absences were purely for work. Nothing more, nothing less. It was absurd to even consider any other reason. While such accusations were ridiculous to me, a young child couldn't understand such complex situations. Though my mother-in-law complained and my father-in-law was angry, my priority then was comforting my distressed Michael. I felt such relief when Todd came home and reprimanded his mother for her behavior. Now Todd is away again for work, and I suspect that's why my mother-in-law is taking full advantage of the situation. You might think I'd have more free time now that I'm no longer caring for grandmother, but instead, she's keeping me extremely busy. She constantly hands me complicated recipes, demanding I cook them, and insists on thorough house cleaning. The other day, she invited neighborhood women over for a drama-watching party that started in the afternoon. I thought she was just enjoying herself, but I ended up cleaning the messy room full of snack wrappers and drink stains during the busiest pre-dinner hours. It was unnecessary work that naturally irritated me. She had the audacity to call me troublesome, asking why I wasn't finished yet and telling me to hurry up with dinner preparations. I was sweating from cleaning, desperately trying to meet her demands. Yet when dinner time came, she didn't even come to the table, claiming she was too full from snacks. I was completely fed up. That's when Michael expressed his concerns to me. He told me his grandmother had said she hated me and wished I would disappear. He felt sick about it and suggested that maybe I should live separately from her, believing his father would understand. I calmed my upset son and drove him home. Obviously, this situation couldn't continue. I needed to have a serious discussion with Todd immediately. The day after Michael left, my worries shifted from my mother-in-law to something else entirely. I suddenly started feeling unwell. My hands and feet were cold, but my face felt hot, and sweat was pouring down like a waterfall. The menopausal symptoms were particularly severe that day. I'd been feeling off since last year, and the doctor had confirmed it was menopause. For now, I was managing without medication, but some days were truly difficult. Perhaps the stress from hearing about my mother-in-law's attitude was making it worse. The symptoms worsened in the afternoon, and I was lying in my bedroom. Then I heard my mother-in-law's heavy footsteps approaching, demanding to know why I was sleeping and asking about dinner. I had such a severe headache that I could barely get up, let alone deal with her. I thought about pretending to be asleep, but she suddenly yanked off my blanket, forcing me to get up reluctantly. She clapped her hands commandingly and barked dinner. I thought to myself, if she wanted dinner so badly, she could make it herself. I wondered why she always acted as if she were someone special, expecting me to prepare everything for her. Todd's grandmother used to be in charge of cooking, but lately, it had become my responsibility. My mother-in-law only entered the kitchen when Todd was home, and even then, she merely set the table. I suspected she probably didn't even know how to cook. Completely exhausted, I explained that I wasn't feeling well due to menopause and couldn't handle housework today, asking if she could make dinner instead. She had experienced severe menopause herself, and I had lived with her mood swings during that time. I thought she would understand the pain when I mentioned menopause. However, her reaction was the complete opposite of what I expected. She snorted and suddenly turned a bag upside down over my head. What? I let out a small cry as something suddenly rained down on me. In the dimly lit room, having just woken up feeling unwell, I couldn't tell what it was at first. After a moment, I noticed the smell of potato chips. The overturned bag was nearly empty, but chip crumbs had scattered all over me. I was stunned by this unexpected action. "Stop being lazy," she said as she left the room. Lying in bed in pain after being scolded, I wanted to say something back to her. I wondered how she could behave this way. Rather than anger, I felt a strange sensation, as if I were observing some rare creature. At that moment, I realized my patience was reaching its limit. About 6 months later, I took time off work to prepare for a trip. It was to attend my younger brother's wedding. He had been living with his fiancée for several years, and they were finally getting married. Since they live in another state and the ceremony will be there, I booked a hotel for 3 nights. Given the distance, I decided to stay for the entire event. My younger brother offered to pay for the hotel, but I declined. Since the wedding date was arranged to accommodate my schedule, I wanted to cover the expenses myself. Though it was a small family ceremony, I was looking forward to this rare opportunity for all relatives to gather. Thinking no one would prepare meals during my absence, I made a week's worth of food to leave behind. The night before departure, during dinner, I explained to my father-in-law about the prepared meals in the refrigerator. He thanked me, but as usual, my mother-in-law seemed dissatisfied with everything I did. She frowned and asked why I was going to my younger brother's wedding, assuming it was a second marriage and predicting it would end badly. My father-in-law glared at her as I explained that it was actually the first marriage for both my younger brother and his fiancée. My mother-in-law laughed mockingly. She said a first marriage at 41 must mean there were serious problems, and that it was shameless to have a lavish wedding at that age, clearly confusing my younger brother with someone else or completely forgetting my family structure. I shrugged and explained that I was one of 3 siblings, with a 15-year age gap between me and my youngest younger brother, so he was still young. I clarified that the one getting married was 33, and his partner was in her mid-20s. My mother-in-law raised her eyebrows, looking displeased at being corrected, but quickly adopted a contemptuous expression. She said it was disgusting, assuming the bride was 24 and claiming it was like a parent-child relationship. This time even my father-in-law seemed to notice her mistake and cleared his throat uncomfortably. I held back a sigh and explained it wasn't 24, but mid-20s. The age difference was only 5 or 6 years, which I pointed out was quite normal. I mentioned that I had recently spoken with her on video call, and she seemed like a very sensible young woman. After finishing the conversation with my in-laws, I began preparing for departure. I would see Michael and my parents at the wedding venue. As I carefully packed nice clothes into my suitcase and double-checked that I hadn't forgotten anything, I heard my mother-in-law talking loudly to my father-in-law in the living room. Her words about how good it would feel to have me gone for a while felt like daggers in my back. I bit my lip, knowing that if I showed my anger now, she might interfere with my carefully packed luggage. It was better to endure until I left the house. The next morning, I headed to the entrance pulling my slightly oversized suitcase. I paused briefly when she told me never to come back and suggested I should get divorced and leave. "Yes, I'll do as you said," I responded cheerfully, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. Perhaps I was more relieved about this situation than I had realized. In truth, my patience had reached its limit long ago. Actually, Todd and I had already discussed and quietly prepared everything for this day. "Stop talking nonsense and just leave," my mother-in-law laughed loudly while eating snacks early in the morning. I was amazed at how much she could eat right after waking up. I decided to take a taxi but turned back one last time to look at the family home. "I'm truly grateful to this house," I said pensively. Except for my mother-in-law, I had always been thankful for this place. I felt indebted to Todd's grandmother, father-in-law, Todd, Michael, and even to the roof and walls. But I couldn't remember a single time when I needed my mother-in-law's help. Still, my heart felt incredibly light. I quickened my pace, pulling my slightly oversized suitcase toward the place where my loving family awaited. I planned to stay at the hotel for 3 nights and 4 days. After that, I had preparations ready to move to a new place where I could live alone. I met Todd at my younger brother's wedding venue. This had been planned in advance. The timing of the wedding was specifically set so Todd could attend. "It's been a tough day." "I brought this," Todd said with a melancholic smile, pulling out divorce papers. His name wasn't written on them yet. We were to sign them together as our final act as husband and wife. "Thank you," I said as I signed. I told him I had booked a double room at the hotel, asking if that was okay. Though it was sad on my younger brother's wedding day, this was also our new beginning. I acknowledged it might be inappropriate to sign divorce papers on a wedding day, and mentioned we would need to announce our divorce later, though we wouldn't say anything in front of everyone today. "Of course, the double room is fine." "Thanks for making the reservation," Todd replied, and we exchanged gentle smiles. No one could imagine we would be signing divorce papers in just a few hours. I was surprised at how heavy a single piece of paper could feel. Once submitted, we would no longer be husband and wife after more than 31 years together. Everything would be decided by a single piece of paper. "I'm truly sorry," Todd apologized, but I shook my head. Being with Todd had brought me real happiness. From the day we married, I knew he would often be away, and that never bothered me. It was just his mother I couldn't get along with. "Don't apologize. You were a wonderful husband. Let's be good friends from now on," I said through tears, with genuine love in my heart. Todd took my hand and thanked me for everything. Tears welled up in my eyes too. Secretly, I decided these were tears of joy for my younger brother's wedding. The next day, Todd returned home alone to explain the situation to his parents. At first, his father was shocked by the sudden news of divorce, but once he understood the circumstances, he became furious. He shouted about how we had dared to drive away the person who had cared for his mother until the end, and my mother-in-law clearly panicked. While I had been the primary caregiver for Todd's grandmother, handling physically demanding tasks like bathing, my father-in-law, who had always been strong, helped toward the end. He handled tasks like turning her in bed. In a way, my father-in-law and I had been caregiving partners. Meanwhile, my mother-in-law had been absolutely no help at all. Apparently, my father-in-law had been silently harboring resentment about this. He went on about how terrible she had been with housework since marriage, how he'd kept quiet because she'd given birth to their son, but she'd used his mother's kindness as an excuse to avoid helping. He said she was nothing like me, who handled everything. When my mother-in-law tried to argue against the comparison, my father-in-law cut her off. "You're the one who should have left. To lose such a hard-working daughter-in-law. Do you realize how much Linda's salary provided for our luxurious lifestyle? You haven't earned a single penny." The conversation became more tense when money was mentioned. My mother-in-law was in a weak position. She had never worked outside the home, and all expenses, including their living costs, were covered by Todd. As a sailor, Todd earned a good salary, and my in-laws used their entire pension as pocket money. Honestly, our family was well off. Todd's income alone could have covered our child's expenses and his grandmother's care costs. But I found fulfillment in working, so I didn't mind using my salary for the family. I bought them travel and theater tickets, and took them to expensive restaurants on birthdays. Actually, these gifts were also investments in securing my own time. "It's not too late, Todd. Apologize now and marry Linda again," my father-in-law finally said, realizing how precarious his wife's position was. My mother-in-law was completely distraught, but it was too late to avoid the consequences of her actions. "This is my house. Get out," my father-in-law roared and began forcing her out. Naturally, she resisted desperately, screaming and pulling at her hair in frustration. Her angry cries and despair created a strange and truly frightening scene. "I won't leave. I don't want a divorce. How can I live alone at this age?" she cried out in final resistance, but she was no match for my well-built father-in-law, who dragged her outside. He firmly closed the door and locked it. She clung to the door, crying so loudly that neighbors heard the commotion and called the police. When dealing with the police, my father-in-law reluctantly opened the door, but his anger hadn't subsided. For several days, my father and mother-in-law lived in the same house as if separated. They didn't exchange a single word and even avoided eye contact. Whenever my father-in-law entered a room, my mother-in-law would flee in terror. This situation couldn't continue, so finally my father-in-law called his daughter who lived far away for a family meeting. He declared his intention to divorce, but his daughter showed sympathy for her mother and opposed the idea, making the discussion difficult. Todd explained in detail all the harassment I had endured. He revealed how his mother had even lied to turn Michael against me. Todd presented emails our son had written as evidence and spoke about my struggles with menopause. My father-in-law, who had witnessed everything until then, expressed his condemnation. I hadn't known, but he had told her to stop her behavior and advised her to apologize, but she never did. And now, she had unjustly criticized my younger brother and mocked me. Todd added how I had taken on all household duties and cared for his grandmother alongside the helpers. When Todd asked his sister how she would feel if her husband's mother did the same to her, and whose side she would take if her father supported her, she fell silent. Seeing this, my mother-in-law became even more enraged. She demanded to know if her daughter was also against her, claiming all she had done in raising her, though ironically, she hadn't even pretended to be involved in childcare. Todd had always told me about this. Most of the time, his grandmother had taken care of him and his sister while their mother was out with neighbors. Perhaps remembering the past, Todd's sister looked at her mother with contempt. In this house, only his grandmother and I had truly taken care of everyone until the end. Although she had given birth to 3 children, my mother-in-law had never involved herself in housework, only enjoying the benefits of family life. Finally, her habitual negligence became apparent to the family, and her position completely crumbled. Understanding her situation, she stopped screaming and began crying inconsolably. In the end, out of sympathy, the divorce was called off, but my father-in-law said he was considering separation. Hearing this, I expressed my wish to meet with him. All these events after my departure were related to me by Todd. I acknowledged that I couldn't say much since I hadn't been there, but I remarked that if his father was so angry, he should have helped me from the beginning. Todd sighed dejectedly while drinking his hot coffee. We were at his favorite cafe, one he'd loved since his youth. He ordered coffee while I chose a sweet drink I hadn't had in a long time. As I listened to the account of his mother's shameful behavior, I smiled gently. I told him not to blame himself so much, reminding him that he had been away for work. Important work that many people depended on. I assured him I understood that. My words of encouragement weren't false. Todd's work as a sailor was admirable. He worked in shipping, supporting people's lives. Sometimes he was away for years at a time. I found that amazing. That's why I had endured everything until now. I felt apologetic that I couldn't endure it this time. Finally, I was able to express the words that had been stuck in my chest for so long. That I just couldn't remain a member of his parents' family anymore. Todd looked a bit sad, but showed understanding. He didn't blindly take his parents' side just because they were family, but understood the situation fairly. That made me incredibly happy. I couldn't help but smile broadly, and Todd gazed at me as if enchanted. I later learned that at that moment, he thought, "She's beautiful. Her smile is more radiant than ever before." I too thought Todd had never looked more gentle. To continue the story, the day after meeting Todd at the cafe, I met with his father with Todd's help. This was the final stage of my revenge. When my father-in-law came to the cafe, he was dressed a bit more nicely than usual as he had plans to go out afterward. After brief small talk about the weather, we got straight to the point. I mentioned hearing from Todd about his thoughts of separating from his wife, and suggested that while he might manage alone while healthy, it could be difficult later, especially after all this trouble. I offered to help with his daily life if they really did separate. My father-in-law was clearly pleased with this proposal. Todd's sister lived far away, and Todd himself was often away at sea for long periods. Since he wasn't good at household tasks like cooking, cleaning, and laundry, my help would surely be appreciated. He frowned, crossed his arms, and said maybe separation wasn't enough. Divorce might be better. While I had expected them to separate, the situation was developing even more unfavorably for my mother-in-law. He continued, saying that if he died suddenly, she would make a huge fuss, so it would be better to divorce properly beforehand. Todd looked as if he wanted to say, "Here it comes," when his father started speaking with determination. Once my father-in-law made up his mind, he tended to act quickly. Sometimes he could go overboard, but that was his nature. Knowing this, I nodded with a satisfied smile, feeling great satisfaction at how things were unfolding. I commented on how forward-thinking he was, expressing admiration for his foresight. Having lived with him for years, I understood how to handle my father-in-law. A little encouragement like this would likely lead to his decision. Todd noticed my intention and smiled but didn't try to stop me. He was clearly angrier at his mother's behavior than I was. My father-in-law, energized, immediately stood up to get divorce papers. Out of kindness, I offered to introduce him to the lawyer Todd and I had consulted about our divorce. From that day, he began actively working to make the divorce official. It was clear my mother-in-law would lead a lonely life. 2 weeks later, I returned to what was now just my in-laws' house to collect belongings I couldn't take before. While I had already removed valuables, it had been impossible to take everything. Years of living there had accumulated many personal items. Clothes, books, cherished photos, my son's childhood drawings, bed linens, and furniture I bought with my own money. This visit would be the last time I saw my mother-in-law. By then, the divorce was decided, and she was clearly distraught. While I was packing, she knelt before me with a pale face, begging me to forgive her, claiming it was all a joke, and pleading with me to come back and persuade her husband. I completely ignored her and continued packing. After pleading for a while, she suddenly stood up. Angered by being ignored, she reverted to her old attitude and began hurling terrible insults. She screamed about how humble she was being, how I'd been nothing but trouble since marrying into the family, and that I should leave and die alone, adding other simple but unrepeatable insults. I ignored her and continued packing boxes. Suddenly she screamed and lunged at the boxes. As I dodged in surprise, she overturned a box containing carefully folded clothes. The clothes scattered across the floor, and she began stomping and kicking them like a tantrum. "Stop it!" Todd shouted at his mother with angry eyes. Usually obedient to her son, she froze as if it were the end of the world. I restrained Todd with my hand and looked at my mother-in-law expressionlessly. I told her I was no longer her daughter-in-law, she was no longer my mother-in-law, our relationship was completely over. I expressed no gratitude to her, only to her mother, father, and husband who had helped me. Moving quickly around the scattered clothes, I packed them without refolding and lifted the box. "Please don't touch my belongings, stranger," I said.
Goodbye.
I threw these final words at my pitiful former mother-in-law and hurried from the room. I had no desire to share space with this woman for even another minute. I called Todd to handle the remaining luggage, got into my younger brother's waiting car, and prepared to leave. I could hear my former mother-in-law's screams from inside the house, but they weren't worth listening to. I heard that after we left, she hit her head and continued lamenting terribly. While there was no possibility of reconciliation for me, she seemed to deeply regret cutting off her last hope. However, her regret came too late to matter to anyone. About a month later, my former mother-in-law moved out and began living alone in a modest place. Todd visits occasionally to check on her, as does his sister. I hear she now wears old clothes as housewear and can't even be bothered to bathe regularly. She rarely goes out except for shopping and lives on fast food. Having fallen into financial hardship, my former mother-in-law now spends her days eating snacks while lamenting her situation. Though there was some division of property in the divorce process with my former father-in-law, the amount was small, leaving her facing financial insecurity in her old age. I don't know what his sister is doing, but I have no intention of providing any support. Todd told me this with a resigned shrug. As a well-paid sailor, he had been his mother's pride, but she probably never imagined being completely abandoned by her son. This all happened because she continued to disregard me, the wife her son had chosen. Ironically, after telling me to never come back and to get divorced, she's the one who can't return now. It's just as the saying goes, curses come home to roost. She should have prepared for her own misfortune before wishing it upon others. 5 years after the divorce, I'm enjoying a peaceful life with my cat in an apartment about 25 minutes by car from my former in-laws' house. I found this pet-friendly property while looking for a convenient commute to work. It's a lovely place with natural light. I visit my former father-in-law's house once a week to cook various meals. Our relationship has improved since the divorce. Though my sister-in-law who lives far away can barely meet my eyes, I continue to help her as before. Todd and I still keep in touch. In fact, whenever he returns from his long voyages, we always go on dates. It's as if we're newly dating. We watch movies, visit museums. These relatively new experiences make our relationship feel fresh and exciting. It's surprisingly enjoyable to talk on the phone for hours and exchange messages. When Michael visits us on holidays, he jokes, "This must be a fake divorce. You two just went back to being lovers." But actually, Todd and I were never lovers before. Ours was an arranged marriage with no dating period. So in a way, we're building a romantic relationship for the first time now. We have a secret plan to remarry when he's released from his responsibilities to his mother, whether through her death, moving in with his sister, or entering a facility. Todd has suggested it will be when his mother's welfare checks are no longer needed. Discussions about her living with his sister's family or entering a facility have already begun. Our reunion might not be far off. Having spent over 31 years together and now approaching 55, it's a bit embarrassing to talk like this, but my heart flutters at the possibility of experiencing true love with Todd, whom I've always deeply loved. Thank you for sharing this time with me. Thank you for reading my story and following my life journey. Today, I wanted to share my personal perspective on what I've experienced, what I've learned, and how my life has changed. I'd also love to hear your thoughts and experiences, as I believe we can learn so much from each other. My life has been shaped by a series of events that have made me who I am today. My story isn't just about challenges and victories. It's a journey of self-discovery and personal growth. Sometimes when I look back, I realize how much I've changed and how crucial these difficult experiences were to my growth. Her behavior and treatment of me was certainly one of the greatest trials I faced. It was challenging to deal with someone who constantly questioned and belittled my efforts instead of supporting me. But ultimately, these experiences made me stronger and taught me to value my own worth. I wonder, have any of you faced situations where people close to you failed to acknowledge your efforts or dismissed them? How did you handle such situations? In my case, I realized that no matter how my mother-in-law treated me, it was crucial to maintain my integrity and self-respect. It wasn't easy, but I learned to stand strong and not let others' actions define my sense of self. The divorce process was also a time of major change and adjustment. While it was painful, it was also liberating. There were times when I questioned whether I was making the right decision and if it was fair to everyone involved. Looking back, though, I realized that divorce wasn't just a physical separation. It was an opportunity to rediscover myself and what I truly wanted in life. Finally, I want to share something very personal. After all these years and experiences, I now feel more at peace and in harmony with what I truly want in life. I've realized that even through difficulties and obstacles, I've grown in ways I never imagined. My current apartment life with my cat represents my independence and the peace I've found in my own space. I want you to know that every trial, every conflict, every difficult moment has meaning. Even when everything seems to be working against you, there are lessons to learn and strength to discover. I hope that by sharing my story, I can encourage you to face your own trials with courage and pursue your own peace and happiness. What has life taught you about facing challenges and pursuing happiness? What's the most valuable lesson you've learned in your own life? I truly believe we can learn so much from each other, and I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences. Thank you for joining me in this reflection. I hope my story resonates with you in some way, and that we can continue to learn and grow together. I look forward to hearing your comments and experiences.